Hello, class. Rishi, Keir and Ed are off to Manchester, Liverpool and Bournemouth, and they all want to get back to Downing Street by high-speed rail. Or maybe not. This morning's exam question. Who's going to get there first? And should one of them not even bother trying? Please show your workings. It looks as though the sums on HS2, Britain's biggest infrastructure project, just won't add up anymore. What would Labour do? Rumours about a Rishi revolution. More maths, less inheritance tax and no smoking at all. Are we seeing the real Sunak at last? And Ed Davey rides into town to kick off the conference season. Grant Shapps is now the Defence Secretary, but one of his many former jobs was Transport Secretary. Just what we need to discuss the potential demise of HS2 to Manchester. Andy Burnham is the Mayor of Manchester, unlikely to be shy of giving us his views of government, or even his own Labour Party does pull the plug on what would have been the standard bearer for levelling up. Ed Davey leads the Liberal Democrats and has hot-footed it from Bournemouth to be with us. But can his party really be a big player at the next election? Lionel Shriver is a best-selling author you might know from We Need to Talk About Kevin. But she's here to talk about Britain and why she's leaving. With us through the morning, three journalists who unusually can add up and talk about both prime ministers and prime numbers. Lionel Barber, former editor of the Financial Times. Miranda Green, deputy comment editor of the FT and one-time advisor to Paddy Ashdown. And Jeff Randall, formerly business supremo here at Sky News, the BBC and the Sunday Times. He's now chair of Woburn Partners. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. It's conference time. Probably the oldest cliche in this business is that a week is a long time in politics. The next 3 weeks may seem like an eternity. We can expect bucket loads of policy promises from each party leader. There will be many impassioned speeches about Britain's long-term future. But the calculations being made in the political back rooms are all about what happens between now and January 2025. We'll be showing you what it all adds up to. A short time ago, I spoke to the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. Grant Shapps, is it true that the government is actively considering cutting inheritance tax?
Well, you certainly have to wait for a budget or another event for the government to set out whatever the plans will be. I mean, look, generically, I'm in favour of all taxes being lower, but we've got to be fiscally responsible. We can't do that until money's available to cut whichever tax you have.
But there is the active conversation on this.
Well, the Chancellor will always be looking at all the taxes. I'm afraid I can't really shed light on one specific tax over another one. If you're asking me, I'm a fiscal conservative. I like to see lower taxes, but we do have to be responsible. Unfortunately, I just lost a parent, and I can understand entirely why people find inheritance tax particularly punitive. However, there are lots of different tax considerations for the Chancellor. We will have to wait for the Chancellor.
Well, let's just for the moment focus on the principle of this one. Let me show you what Paul Johnson, who is, as you know, the boss of the independent forecaster, the IFS. This is what he said. He said, "I despair. There was speculation published the government considering abolishing inheritance tax as a pre-election giveaway. If this has any basis in truth, one wonders what is the point of all the work done by the OBR, which set out on Thursday in the starkest of terms severe fiscal challenges that face us. What is the question to which abolishing inheritance tax is any sort of plausible answer?" What is the question to which it's an answer?
Well, look, newspapers spend their time having to fill the columns, right? And they write stories.
I think that's a bit unfair. They don't write them just because they make it up. Somebody tells them this is having a conversation.
I mean, I could name many, many examples of stories which have actually
Okay, well, we don't do that at
basis.
Sky here.
Of course not. But nonetheless, you're taking it from a story in the paper. Look, it's right that every single tax is kept under consideration. I mean, I just mentioned, I think that inheritance tax is particularly punitive and unfair. But nonetheless, we also understand that we're in a fiscal straitjacket. And the Chancellor said only last week that, looking ahead to the autumn statement and the budgets, that he doesn't see room for tax cuts. You're asking me about something for which decisions haven't been made, and you'd expect those to be made properly by the
but there is a discussion to be had about this. And I think what most people, and this is what I guess Johnson was saying, are puzzled by is why get into a tizzy about this one. It only affects 4% of estates, raises maybe 7 billion, mostly from very rich people. It is not going to fill the holes that the Chancellor's got to deal with, which are much bigger, and you're going to create a big political storm over something that's really quite small beer.
Well, again, I point out what you're responding to here is newspaper speculation, not a government announcement. Newspapers are there to
inspired
speculate.
by your colleagues.
Well, there's certainly people who believe that it's an unfair tax. And I would point out this about inheritance tax. You're right, not everyone pays it. I think it's a question for many people of aspiration, and people know that there's something deeply unfair about being taxed all their lives and then being taxed in death as well. But as I say, there's no actual question on the table here because no decisions have been made about these fiscal questions, and the Chancellor will do that in due time.
All right, well, let me just deal with another piece of speculation which presumably comes out of nowhere, and no minister has actually said this to a journalist, that you're talking about a potential real terms cut in benefits. No decision's been made, but would you personally be comfortable with that?
Well, again, any government has to make the budget stack up, for sure. Secondly, I'd say that when it comes to things like the way that we treat people in the tax system, in particular, actually going back to income tax. Do you remember what the income tax threshold was when we came to power? You had to start paying income tax at £6,470. It's now nearly £12,500. That is a massissive tax break, which is aimed at people who are earning less. And so if you're asking where my heart is in this, it's always to ensure that people who, in particular people working and people at the lower end of that income scale, are able to keep more of their cash.
All right, well, let's talk about the other big story of the day. The Prime Minister presented himself this week as a man determined to be honest with the public, long-term decision so that people and businesses can plan for a brighter future. Biggest long-term decision that you have in front of you, will HS2 run from Euston to Manchester?
So HS2 is a huge infrastructure project. I was
it's the biggest
charged with it for
3.5
years. It's a huge, as you say, it's the biggest single one, I think, probably in Europe. And there is always going to be, and there has always been, and rightly should be, a question of how you pace the development of that line. There were decisions that I had to make at the time about it, particularly with reference to the eastern leg at that particular moment in time, and every government wants to take that under consideration. Again, it's not my area these days. There's no actual decisions made as yet. I'm seeing quite a lot of speculation about it. Actually, when you think about the size of the project and the amount of money that goes into that, as opposed to, you were just talking about welfare, for example, every government has to make that decision, and that's absolutely right. The point that Rishi...
So what you're saying is it's plausible, it's on the table, that you may need to cut the cost of this, and one way of doing that would be to run the line only as far as Acton and West London and only as far as Birmingham. It's one possibility.
As I say, I think it's a question of sequencing, but to your wider point that you actually started off with, Rishi Sunak is the kind of Prime Minister who's prepared to take these difficult long-term decisions. Not always popular. We saw, for example...
HS2 is one of those difficult decisions.
Well, certainly it's difficult in terms of the pacing and the expectations, but we saw not just with HS2, but with our pace of change with net zero this week, that just because the media says this must be done, just because some people will say, these are the popular things to do, he's prepared to do long-term difficult things as well.
Let's not get all tied up with what media say and what they don't say. 80 business leaders have written to the Prime Minister because they certainly believe that this is possible. And here's what they say to to the Prime Minister. It makes no sense for the country to build a high-speed railway from Birmingham to Ealing. Now, you can say it's speculation, but here's the practical point. All of these people who have already sunk money into projects, expanding headquarters into Manchester and so on the government's say-so this is going to happen, believed that it was going to happen, and now don't think it will. And every answer that you give that doesn't give them reassurance costs money. So, is it going to run from central London to Manchester or not?
Well, forgive me, I'm not the Transport Secretary. Those are decisions that the Transport Secretary and the Chancellor...
It is a decision under active consideration.
Well, as I say, it's a question of how you pace these things. And it's all very well to take an absolutist line and say, unless you do this thing tomorrow, you know, commit fully to all of this, whatever the project is, in this case, a very expensive railway line. But you can say that in isolation. What about the other issues that you raise? Those issues of the defence budget, for example, or those issues of...
We're going to come to the wider thing.
But the wider point I'm trying to make is money is not infinite.
We're going to come to that wider thing. But I want to stick with business leaders, because these people have put real money into the ground. And look, here's the next thing that they say in the same letter. Over the last 2 decades, we've had repeated promises of infrastructure investment made to cities, including Manchester, Glasgow, Leeds, Sheffield and London. As business leaders, we have invested in our industries on the back of those promises. Now, you were the business minister, secretary. You were the transport secretary. I'm assuming that some of those promises would have been made by you. And what these people are saying is, you told us it's going to happen. Now you're uncertain about whether it's going to happen. We have spent the money. Did you personally encourage people to invest on the basis that HS2 would run from central London to Manchester?
Well, so actually, we've already spent 33 billion
Did
pounds.
you encourage businesses, London to Manchester, did you encourage them to spend on that basis?
I do want to see better infrastructure, and the point I'm trying to make, you've got to let me finish the sentence, otherwise your audience won't know the point I'm trying to make.
You're answering a different question.
No, I'm not
asking you, when you talk to business leaders, as Transport Secretary, as Business Secretary, did you say to them, look, it's worth investing in the North in this way because there will be HS2? Did you say that?
I hope you'll let me get my answer out. I
want you to an answer to that question, not to another question.
I certainly said to them, this government is committed to improving rail infrastructure, and in particular in the North, and we spent £33 billion, a record amount, since 2010, on rail infrastructure in the North. I've also said, I believe in greater connectivity. You've also got to realise that in that time, coronavirus happened. People stopped travelling entirely for a while and haven't gone back to the normal patterns of travel. Any government that doesn't then look at their plans and resequence them is, I'm afraid, acting outside of the reality of the situation. And it goes back to the point that the Prime Minister was making. He's prepared to take the difficult decisions, not always the popular decisions at that moment in time, but the right decisions long-term for this country.
Well, that's OK. You're now explaining to me why you might take the decision that you say is just speculation. Would you like simply to say to these people who are, let me tell you, because I've spoken to a couple of them, are furious with you, would you like to apologise to them for saying to them, spend your money, we'll make sure the link is there, and now you're in a position where this morning they're watching this programme and they're none the wiser about whether they have spent their shareholders' money unwisely or not?
Well, to point out, you're actually asking me about a speculative story in the newspaper rather than actual government policy. You will have to wait for more on sequencing.
But my point is, no, we don't have the government policy. People who have to make investment decisions need to know what you're going to do.
Right. The simple answer is we will always invest in the infrastructure of this country, and as has been our record. It's not just HS2, but also the £33 billion that I talked about, and the integrated rail plan, which, without digging into too much of the detail, is about rail from the Midlands up into the North, and is the biggest ever plan that we've seen. So we are investing that money. So the first thing I'd say to those business people is we have already been, and we already continue to spend that money, regardless of the sequencing of exactly
how quickly they thought you were going to
spend
it because of what you told them.
Well, because the country has to respond to the circumstances. We did not know there would be coronavirus, a 1 in 100 year event that costs the country hundreds of billions, about £400 billion. We didn't know there'd be a war on in Europe, something that I hope we can talk about in my role as Defence Secretary, and the costs to the country of that war and supporting the effort and preventing the tyrant coming across Europe. So, of course, as circumstance changes, you have to look at the sequencing of the big infrastructure cash that you spend. Any government that doesn't do that, any opposition who claims you don't need to, is not fit to govern this country.
All right, let me put to you the word of somebody that I think you ought to pay some attention to, which is your former boss, Boris Johnson, who says on this topic, it makes no sense at all to deliver a mutilated HS2, the height of insanity, to announce all this just before a party conference in Manchester. Now, he's the guy who, when he's your boss, basically said this is going to happen, and he said it after coronavirus. Is he just completely out of his head here?
Well, for a start, we haven't had an announcement. I keep going back to the fact that you are asking me about a bunch of newspaper speculation rather than an actual announcement. But it is the case, I don't want to sort of fudge this, it is the case that all of these big decisions, where budgets are, in particular in the case of HS2, inexorably going higher and higher and higher, and your viewers are having to pay that bill, it's absolutely right that a government looks at it and says, hold on a minute, is this just a sort of open-ended check, or are we going to make sure that this project gets delivered to a pace and a timetable that actually works for the taxpayer?
It sounds like you're making the case, if I may say so, for resequencing, which is perfectly reasonable, but I think the point is people want to know, when will we have an announcement?
Well, in due course, as I say, I'm not the Transport Secretary, so I'm afraid because we're talking about a story which is speculation, I can't tell you exactly. But what I can say is that we take those long-term decisions seriously, but we don't think that any amount of money, no matter how big the budget gets, you should just carry on ploughing it in. There has to be a point at which you say, hold on a minute, let's just take a break here.
OK, you say long-term decisions, but I'll make one last try on this. The people who wrote to the Prime Minister would say, you talk about long-term decisions, but the long term seems to get shorter and shorter, and you can't even stick to the ones that you made a couple of years ago when you were Business and Transport Secretary, previous to that. So where is this long-term thinking?
Again, at risk of repeating myself, no one knew that coronavirus would stop people from travelling in a way which is fundamental to our transport network. It's not just a sideshow. People stop going to work every day.
OK, I won't repeat the question if you don't.
So, things have changed. If you don't stop and reflect after things have changed, that is a foolish approach.
All right. You're going to bin HS2, essentially. That's what I'm getting from this. And we started this conversation talking about the Prime Minister's pledge to be honest about long-term decisions. You haven't told me really what you do about inheritance tax, long-term decision. You can't tell me what's going to happen about HS2. If I had time to ask about triple lock on pensions, I don't suppose you'd say anything about that. The viewer might be forgiven for thinking that in spite of all the talk about long-term decisions of being honest about these issues, you aren't being honest because you don't actually have a long-term plan.
Well, forgive me, Trevor. I think your viewers understand that I'm not here today to deliver the budget on your excellent programme. I'm here to talk about actually things that I can inform you about, which is, for example, in my role as Defence Secretary, our work in Ukraine, our attitude towards defending this country and many other things. You are asking about a bunch of things outside of my portfolio area, and I'm trying to tell you that no decisions have been made, and I understand that you're pushing me to make those decisions. I can't because they haven't been made yet. All
right. It's difficult to escape the suspicion that long-term for you is not 10 years or 20 years. It is January 2025 when there's the next election. That's what this is all about. I disagree actually fundamentally with that, because if you were asking... You've pointed out a bunch of things to me this morning you say are unpopular. And you've shown letters to prove your point. My point is we are prepared to take those difficult long-term decisions, even when they are unpopular, if they are in the long-term interests of this country. All right. Just very briefly, I did want to give you a chance to say something about Ukraine. Is there Ukraine fatigue creeping into the West? Well, I think
we're 19 months into this now. On Tuesday, I was out in Ramstein in Germany meeting with 50 countries who are all supporting Ukraine. This is NATO plus a bunch of other nations. And certainly within that room, we were all absolutely solidly behind Ukraine. And I'll say this, I think the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. We haven't forgotten how a tyrant has walked in to his democratic neighbour. And if we don't stop him, we know from history what happens after that. And that is why we are continuing our support. I've just announced tens of thousands of additional rounds of ammunition, taking us up to about 300,000 rounds so far, and we provided a huge amount of additional support and equipment. By the end of this year, our goal is to have trained 30,000 Ukrainian troops. So I don't think the British resolve is wavering in any way, shape or form, and we will stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians.
Right, Shapps, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. So let's get some reaction from our panel. The former editor of the Financial Times, Lionel Barber, the former business editor of the BBC and Sunday Times, and now chair of Woburn Partners, Jeff Randall, and journalist and one-time Lib Dem advisor, Miranda Green. Jeff, what do you think businesses are going to make of Grant Shapps's non-explanation this morning?
Trevor, good morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Nice to be back on Sky.
Back and home.
What do I think about business and that interview? To be honest, I don't think that they will be surprised. I mean, regularly you have the unenviable task of interviewing ministers who are determined to say nothing for 15 minutes. I thought we did it rather well, but clearly he was playing a dead bat. I thought it was quite funny when he said, oh, well, I'm not the Transport Secretary. Well, he was 5 minutes ago, and I suspect he knows what's going on, but he's paid to come here and say nothing. I'm sure business will be frustrated. Just a point on business, though. I mean, business has a vested interest in this, HS2. And, of course, there are considerable benefits down the line to business. But it's slightly disingenuous for business to insist that this goes ahead, because business gets the benefit and the rest of us pay. And on the latest study, for every pound spent going forward on HS2, the benefit is 90p. Well, no business that I know of would invest on that basis. That's the road to ruin.
Miranda, did you... I mean, there must be something, I suppose, to be said for his argument that coronavirus and Ukraine have changed the equation. But I have to say we get that a lot in these interviews.
Well, the problem is that we have a government which, what seems like a few minutes ago, was committed to something called levelling up the country, which is a really serious project if we're going to have a prosperous nation, whereas prosperous everywhere outside London and the South East. If you then mess with flagship infrastructure projects, which are supposed to, raise incomes, raise productivity, raise business activity across the north of England, you're seriously hitting at your own flagship policy. And I think it's going to go down very badly in Manchester, where the Conservative Party is about to have their conference, by the way. So they certainly can't cancel the Manchester leg just before their conference or during it, because can you imagine the reaction locally? And I think it's just part of, as you were putting to him, this attempt to say that these are long-term decisions and long-term policy propositions, when actually what they're focused on is the elections. They're very short-term. We've had an extraordinary week of Number 10 throwing out policy idea after policy idea, everything from fining NHS patients for not turning up, to cancelling A-levels, now to saving money by cancelling HS2. And really, you have to wonder, is this a long-term prospectus or just a sort of panic, kite flying before they put their manifesto together?
Lionel, when you were editing the FT, I think it was a theme that you turned to a lot, this issue of long-termism, short-termism. We're seeing the reality of that now, I suppose.
Well, what he didn't say was incredibly revealing. This is an utterly half-baked project. Initially priced at 30 billion, it's now heading towards over 100 billion. It's been flawed from the outset. It's going to create a huge scar down the centre of the country. Bits have been lopped off. Initially, what would have worked is if we committed long-term to an integrated railway system, not just in British terms, but linked to the continent. So you'd get on a plane, you'd get on a train, Edinburgh, go down through Manchester, London. You'd then go seamlessly on through the Channel Tunnel, Zurich, Frankfurt, you name it. This, by the way, has got nothing to do with Brexit. The other thing that he didn't mention was that they actually cut the bit in London, never mind the north, so that the passengers have to get, with all their bags, Euston to St Pancras. They've cut that bit. It's become actually an utter embarrassment, and it should be scrapped.
Does any of you think it was a good idea from the beginning, in principle?
No.
I did. No, I did. I'm going to disagree with my eminent colleagues here, because I think that the northern cities of England cannot really function because they haven't got any sort of infrastructure that links them up. And, you know, one of the reasons why Sunak is now able to kind of focus on the motorist and trying to sort of weaponise the motorist in the run-up to the election campaign by going back on some of these green targets and EV vehicles and all the rest of it, is because if you live outside London and the South East, you are dependent on your car pretty much because the public transport infrastructure is not there. So I think that actually, if we were to go back to the drawing board, as Lionel has said, you would design a proper set of link-ups in the north of England and maybe, you know, never have gone for the London to Birmingham. But it's not about 20 minutes, it's about capacity. There isn't enough capacity between England's first and second cities. So you have to address that.
That is a point that a lot of the backers of HS2 make. It's not really about time, it is about capacity. And presumably that's a point for businesses, Jeff.
Look, just because it's desirable doesn't make it affordable. And we talk about the cost here escalating from 30 billion to 100 billion. I bet if it did go ahead, 100 billion wouldn't be close. It would be much more than that. But the cost we never talk about is the opportunity cost. What could you do with the money? Now, I'm wholly in favour of the levelling up agenda in the north. I think we owe it to the people in the north. We made promises. And they voted for this government on the basis of those promises. But what else could they do with the money? Hospitals, schools, roads, rail infrastructure.
Just on transport, there is a school of thought that says don't spend money on London to Manchester, spend it on Liverpool to Leeds, for example.
Absolutely.
Fine, I'd be happy with that.
You'd be happy with that.
But that is correct. I mean, to actually spend billions to save 12 minutes or whatever it is from London to Birmingham is irrelevant. And to Jeff's point, if you think of the money that could be spent on other projects, think about broadband, networking Britain, where Grant Shapps is actually correct. Post-COVID, people working from home, the commute is somewhat of an old-fashioned concept.
Just on that point of opportunity cost, Grant Shapps' new department spends 50 billion a year, give or take. £1 or £2. This is
energy and...
No, this is defence.
Defence, sorry, beg your pardon.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. So our entire
defence... He was energy. I keep forgetting. Grant Shapps has spent an average of 10 months in every job. So series to series, you're never quite sure what Grant Shapps is coming in to be.
Come on, Trevor, keep up with the programme here. Look, so he's got a budget of 50 billion for Britain's entire defence system. And we're talking about adding another 80 billion onto HS2 if it went ahead in full. I mean, I just don't think this makes sense for the country as a whole. And for the people in the north, the Tees Valley Mayor said, if you give me 1% of the HS2 budget, I could transform transport in my region.
Trevor, again, Boris Johnson conducted a review of HS2 just 4 years ago. I mean, sorry, 3 years ago. They don't know what to do with it.
No, Boris Johnson is still pro.
Put it out of its misery.
Let me come back to you, Miranda. Besides HS2, we're seeing today, and I know Grant Shapps says it's all speculation, as though no minister ever talked to a journalist. I suppose none of you has ever been briefed by a journalist, I know.
No, never.
But let's suppose...
Been briefed by a politician.
Let's suppose we live in a world where journalists actually know what is being said, and they write stories that say... potential smoking ban, potential cancellation of A-levels for something else, a baccalaureate and so on. Are we beginning to see the real Sunak here, Miranda?
Well, first of all, just so that your viewers are not left in the dark, what happens is that the Sunday papers are briefed by the government. And that's why you find stories about inheritance tax changes on the front pages of several of the newspapers.
Gosh,
it's not some bizarre accident. So
I'm shocked at this suggestion.
Exactly. Grant Shapps is shocked that there's gambling going on in a casino, frankly. So let's put that one to bed. On the issue of inheritance tax, yes, Number 10 does seem to be deciding, and whether it's Sunak himself or a combination of Rishi Sunak and his Australian advisor, Isaac Levido, they are gearing up for what can go in the Tory manifesto. They're absolutely desperate not to come up to the general election with Rishi Sunak and the status quo versus the Labour Party and change. So they are trying to come up with a set of policies and proposals that make it look as if Rishi Sunak can start a new era should he be granted another spell in Downing Street by the voters. The problem is that these ideas, there's no coherence to them. It's not a vision. It's not what is the country I want to build. It's a set of individual things, and we'll see which ones actually fly.
All right, we will continue this conversation a little later. It is just coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, refused to commit to the future of HS2 to Manchester. He said the Prime Minister was prepared for difficult long-term decisions. He also wouldn't really answer questions about reports that inheritance tax could be cut by the government ahead of an election. In a moment, we'll be live in Bolton to speak to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. The Liberal Democrat leader, that's Ed Davey, joins us in the studio on this second day of his party conference in Bournemouth. And why we need to talk about Britain. Lionel Shriver, the award-winning mind behind We Need to Talk About Kevin, tells us why she's leaving the UK for foreign shores. Now, as it sounds, the government's going soft on HS2, the hugely expensive high-speed rail line that was supposed to connect central London to Manchester. There's no one better to speak to this morning than the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Labour's Andy Burnham. The problem for him might be that Labour also seems to be pretty wobbly on the project. Let's find out what he's thinking this morning. Andy Burnham is in Bolton today, heralding the start of his new bus network in public hands for the first time in 40 years. Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning. Morning, Trevor.
I know you want to talk about buses, and I promised we're going to do that, but first, we have to talk about trains. I know that you'll be furious with the government, but will you be equally furious if your own party leadership doesn't commit to building the line in full?
Well, they are committed to it, but like everybody, the Labour Party and ourselves, we will have to respond to what the government says. So we await that decision. But it's very frustrating, Trevor, I've got to say. You know, here we are today in Greater Manchester, putting buses back under public control. We are levelling ourselves up. We are improving public transport. And then I look over there and I see the rug being pulled from under us while we're trying to do it. You know, I've just heard your discussion a minute ago about, you know, oh, well, you should have east-west instead of north-south. I would actually say an east-west line is really important for the north of England, as well as north-south. Why is it always that people here are forced to choose, that we can't have everything? You can have this or you can have that, but you can't have everything. London never has to choose between a north-south line and an east-west line and good public transport within the city. Why is it that people in the north are always forced to choose? Why are we always treated as second-class citizens when it comes to transport? This was the Parliament when they said they would level us up. If they leave a situation where the southern half of the country is connected by modern high-speed lines and the north of England is left with Victorian infrastructure, that is a recipe for the north-south divide to become a north-south chasm over the rest of this century. And that is why people here are fed up with false promises and also watching now what seems to be the desperate acts of a dying government. This is really not right and not fair to people here who were given so many promises.
Andy Burnham, I understand, let's leave the dying government aside for a moment. Let's talk about your own party, where you, I I suspect, have greater influence. And you said that you understand they're committed to it, but in the last week, Pat McFadden, the General Election Supremo for Labour, was asked about it, wouldn't commit. Rachel Reeves was asked about completion of HS2, wouldn't commit. Keir Starmer was asked about it, wouldn't commit. Will you be saying to them today, look, you have to say that it's going to happen? It's not a question of whether you choose this or that, but your own party, which you would say looks like it could be in government, is also, like the Conservatives, not committing to this.
Well, no, there have been commitments, so I'm not sure you're right about that, Trevor. It is stated policy to do both and to do Northern Powerhouse Rail in full. And the point about HS2 is it builds the enabling infrastructure for Northern Powerhouse Rail. So that is a commitment. But as I was just saying, everybody is going to have to respond to what the government announces. And don't let the government off the hook, Trevor. They are the ones who are pulling the plug. So why is this straight away a Labour story?
We've had quite a lot of time talking about the government, and you've just talked about the government. We have talked to Labour leaders in the last week and asked them directly, and none of them will commit to it. Will you say to them this morning it's time for Labour to put its cards on the table and agree that it will that HS2 will run from central London to Manchester?
Well, I have been saying that to them, and I said it yesterday, I will say it again today. The north of England should not be forced to choose between whether we have a good east-west line or a good north-south line. We need modern rail infrastructure here because it's that Victorian infrastructure that is the reason why we have so much rail chaos in the north. You know, other parts of the country have not had to choose. Why do we have to choose? And if you think of it this way, Trevor, if HS2 had started here in the north and was going south, there is no way at all that the government would be cancelling it if it was going south. They would not be cancelling the London leg of HS2 if it had been built the other way round. I'm saying it to my own party, and I'm saying it to the government as well.
I'm not asking you about a choice between north-south and east-west. I am asking you about your own leaders, your own Shadow Chancellor, your own campaign supremo's position. I just want to be clear that you want to say to them that you would like them to say, without ifs or buts, that they will be committed to this project.
Yes, and I did say that a moment ago, but I can say it again. I said it to them yesterday, I will say it to them again today. I said a few seconds ago that we should have both a new north-south line and a new east-west line. And the reason why you have to think about both is because HS2 builds the enabling infrastructure for the Liverpool to Leeds line that you were talking about before. So that is our position. If it is not built, you will leave the north with Victorian infrastructure when the southern half of the country has something much better, and that will actually level us down. So in the Parliament, when the opposite was meant to be happening, the foundations will be laid for the north-south divide to become ever greater in the rest of this century. And that's what's at stake here. You know, I honestly can barely believe that this is what the government are about to do. Days before they come to Manchester for their conference, they are about to ditch a commitment that they've held for 10 years since George Osborne came to Manchester to launch the Northern Powerhouse.
OK, by the way, will the Tories be welcome in Manchester now?
Well, I don't know what they're going to announce. I would say to them, think carefully before you take this decision. You know, think about the city you're coming to. Think about whether it's fair that there is such disparity between the great cities of England in terms of the infrastructure that we have. Of course, we will welcome them, as we always do, but they will also hear directly from us about what we think is fair treatment for our city. You know, no one's been in touch with me yet. This is a huge decision that affects the future of our city and the country, and I'm still waiting to hear from the government as to whether or not our views will even be taken into account as a result of all of this.
Well, that is a striking point that nobody's talked to you, but I want to give you the chance to talk about the buses project. The Manchester B network is now in public hands. It's now your responsibility. You are launching something big. The question I want to ask is it big enough? I mean, have you got enough resource? Are you going to be able to create a big enough network to make a difference?
Well, of course, we will need support if we were to expand it into a true London-style system. That's the ambition that we have. It's government policy. But the government will have to support buses here and elsewhere in the country if that is to be delivered. But this is a really significant day for Greater Manchester today. We've had 40 years of deregulation, Trevor, as have other parts of England. And bus services have gone backwards year after year during that time, to the point where the network has really shrunk back. Overall, passenger journeys have halved in the 40 years of deregulation outside of London. So there is a need to build bus services back up. And this gets me back to the commitments that the government made. They said they would level us up. They said we would have better bus services, better rail infrastructure, and they need to stick to that. But we have taken a big decision here. There's a change, as you can see behind me, coming through onto the streets of Greater Manchester today. The buses are better. We're cutting the cost of public transport by 20% today for people using our buses and our trams. The B network is going to bring real benefits for the travelling public. And I would just say, why are we not getting behind this as a country? Why are we not backing public transport at this particular moment in time? The more the government backs us, the more we can give people a real incentive to leave the car at home.
Just very quickly, hearing Sky correspondents talking to some of people in Manchester, they're saying reliability is going to be the important thing. Are you assuring people of Manchester that this new service will be more reliable than the one they've had before?
Yeah, yes, and they can hold me to account for that. You see, the thing about the deregulated system, Trevor, is if a bus is late or it doesn't turn up at all, there's nothing the public can do. There's no comeback against the operators. In the system that I've created, if they are unreliable, if they are late, there could be a financial consequence for the bus operators. And that's the big difference between what we had and what we've got now. The public are the bosses of the buses, if you like, here in Greater Manchester from today.
Andy Burnham, thank you very much indeed. We will no doubt be seeing you in Manchester next week. Thanks very much. Well, let's get some more reaction from our panel. Lionel Barber, Miranda Green and Jeff Randall are with me. Lionel, Andy Burnham was pretty reluctant to address the fact that his own leadership doesn't really want to commit. This is quite an unhappy situation, isn't it?
Yeah, he's uncomfortable. But that's because Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and the election supremo that you mentioned, Pat McFadden, don't want to tie their hands on spending, and they are desperate to make sure that they appear responsible. They're drawing a direct comparison, it's sort of day in, day out. It's one of the reasons, by the way, I think they're still 20 points ahead in the polls, between competence and responsibility compared to chaos that we had last summer under that brief premiership led by Liz Truss. And the unfunded tax cuts which panicked the markets and for which we're now still paying higher borrowing costs. So I think this is the problem. Andy Burnham as well is an independent mayor. He's a member of the Labour Party, but he works with the Conservatives as well. Successful, independent voice. So he's straddling here. And I have some sympathy for him.
Miranda, but is this a problem for politics in general, that we have these conversations endlessly, and it seems that whatever party they represent, the thing that they want to do is avoid mistakes rather than say, this is what we're going to do?
Well, and, you know, trying to tackle infrastructure problems is probably the most dramatic example of what the UK gets wrong. We can never follow through on a long-term project because we never have proper cross-party consensus and everyone signs up and then it just happens. And I think actually Andy Burnham is fair when he says this wouldn't happen to a London project, actually. And clearly his people feel aggrieved in his region. The problem for the Labour Party, as you and Lionel have been saying, is that you've now got these different tiers of kind of Labour grandees, some of whom, like Andy Burnham, are extremely powerful in their own region. He was always spoken of as a possible leader in waiting.
Now he's King of the North.
Now he's King of the North. So Keir Starmer and his careful Ming vase-holding acolytes like Rachel Reeves and Pat McFadden, they've also got to listen to the sort of shouts from people as powerful as Andy Burnham, wanting them to spend money in their region or to help their region. And it is really difficult. I mean, we've seen that the Labour Party's already had to slightly finesse their massive plans to spend to create what they call the green economy, you know, their green jobs plan. It's now not £28 billion immediately. It's working towards investment of £28 billion. So they're having to cut their cloth according to what they find when they come in.
Jeff, you get the feeling sometimes that devolution, everybody thinks it's a good thing, more power to the people and all that, becomes an obstacle to decision-making.
Well, that is undoubtedly true, because I can think of several occasions where there is a direct clash between what they want in Westminster and what the local government wants out there in the country. But to your interview with Burnham, you know, I have a hunch. My hunch is this, that Rachel Reeves, someone for whom, by the way, I have a high regard, her dearest wish is that the government ditches HS2 and it takes all the flak, because she believes she's going to be the next Chancellor. Could well be. She's going to inherit a money box with nothing in it and a long queue of ministers and other lobby groups saying, Rachel signed this cheque here, Rachel signed that cheque there, and this will be a problem that's taken off her table.
She is a Leeds MP, though. I mean, she represents the people of Leeds,
well,
you know.
It's true.
So...
She may be right, but this is a bit worrying, because if you remember, in 2010, the Labour Treasury Minister also said there's no money left. Yes. After the global financial crisis.
He left a note for his successor.
Exactly. So we are running on empty here. But Jeff's right, actually. I think Rachel Reeves would be delighted if the decision was made. And here's a rather difficult tension here within the government. Sunak and his people in Number 10 want to position himself as an agent of change, something different from the past. But they could be taking a decision which actually helps Labour.
As you know, Miranda, I'm an innocent in this world. And this level of cynicism really shocks me. Do you buy it?
I totally buy it. Yeah, I totally buy it. But I think it's immensely regrettable. And I do think that an incoming Labour government would have to do something about Northern Rail. And as Andy Burnham has pointed out to us, point I was making earlier, actually, that northern leg of HS2 is really embedded with any other transport rail improvement plans that pre-existed, so the Northern Powerhouse. I think you will have to find a Labour government thinking, OK, what edited version of HS2 could we actually get away with, and could we now make affordable? You couldn't just cancel the whole thing.
Jeff, all the business people that you mix with, that you've talked to over the year, from this conversation, they'll be sitting in there watching this with their head in their hands, won't they?
Well, business likes certainty, for sure, and we are now in a period of great uncertainty, some would say chaos, and business likes projects that it benefits from and other people pay for. Hence the letter today about HS2. I think business generally has pretty much lost it with this government. And I think business increasingly is prepared to give Labour a shot, which is, to Lionel's point, while Labour is trying to present itself as so responsible, so fiscally responsible and trustworthy with the money that they will be taking from the taxpayers.
OK, Tories have lost business. You heard it here first. Coming up, we'll hear from the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey.
I'm Helen Ann Smith. I'm Sky's Asia correspondent, and I'm based here in Beijing. My most memorable story was covering the extreme zero COVID restrictions.
A massive COVID wave is sweeping this city, but officially, almost no one has died.
This is a 4-lane dual carriageway, completely shut off. Some things are being allowed in, but actually the only thing we've seen coming out is an ambulance. The message from China is clear. This is a modernised military, absolutely able to fight an international war if needed. Is this military ready?
We are prepared to face every kind of challenge.
My biggest challenge is adequately telling the stories of the Chinese people, even when the authorities would prefer me not to.
Hey.
By the rules, we are allowed to film in the streets.
To the left.
I will always remember the atmosphere at the Shanghai protests. It was an electric mix of excitement, fear, and defiance, and a sense that history was being made. It's hard to express just how incredibly unusual these scenes are in China.
There are people who are afraid.
On the streets of Xinjiang, there is still a tension. Heavy police, a sense they're always watching.
It's really an incredible eeriness to this place, and it just is completely abandoned. The Chinese housing market, for so long a driver of growth, is now a real liability. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's actually hard to describe the cold here. It's so intense. It literally takes your breath away.
I can't tell if I'm moving it or it's moving me, but it's a very strange feeling.
The world is watching what's happening here.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Liberal Democrats are in Bournemouth for their annual conference. The party's been in high spirits recently after some pretty stunning by-election victories. But is that down to the disastrous state of the Conservatives, or is real progress being made by the Lib Dems? A little earlier, I spoke to their leader, Ed Davey. Ed Davey, an election could be just round the corner. Let's talk about it being in spring. Are you ready?
Absolutely. And we're in good heart in our Bournemouth conference. I think it's partly because of all these by-elections we've been winning in the last few years and the council election results. It's so great to see so many new MPs and new councillors. And you know, we're focused on the things that we care about, that the voters care about. So big one is the NHS. That's been a real problem for the government. They're failing miserably, and we've got some, I think, exciting policies which we're debating at Bournemouth. We're talking about the economy, of course, the cost of living, as well as environmental issues. So we've got a really busy conference, and I hope that'll propel us with our message into the election.
Of course, and in your document for a fair deal, you lay out some of this. Let's just talk about the politics of this. What's at the top of your agenda? Is it just to get the Tories out?
Well, clearly we are well placed to get a lot of Conservative MPs out of Parliament and to get the Conservative government out. But we have a Liberal Democrat agenda, which our fair deal pre-manifesto talks about. We believe that our economy is in a real mess. People are really struggling at the moment with high mortgages, high rents, high food, high energy bills. And I think any opposition party who is talking to voters knows that they've got to address those bread and butter issues, and alongside the cost of living, the things we're talking about, the things that voters are talking to us about, are the NHS and the care system, and that's why I've been speaking about that quite a lot now. You
will have read this morning that there is talk about the Prime Minister wanting to slash inheritance tax. Would you support him in that?
No. You know, it's really clear when a Conservative leader is in trouble, they reach for the inheritance tax gig. They've done it before, but they've never delivered on it. And I think people reading that should look at the Conservatives' record on tax. They have raised taxes for people on lower incomes. And the idea they should now be talking about inheritance tax is quite preposterous. It would be a tax cut for the wealthiest. And what Liberal Democrats have done when we had the chance, we took the lowest paid out of income tax by raising the income tax allowance. Look what the Conservatives have done. We took over 3 million people out of income tax completely. Okay. The Conservatives have frozen that, and they've dragged the lowest paid back into income tax. That is a dramatic difference in terms of our priorities and the Conservatives. And that's why we talk about fair deal with real substance on those sorts of issues. I want to come to the
fair deal thing, but let's clear the air on one thing before we go on. You've already implied that you've got your policies, but part of it is that you want to be very different to Conservatives. If you look back now, you're a minister throughout the Conservative-Liberal coalition, you were Energy Secretary. If you had your time again, knowing what you do now, would you have agreed to putting the Conservatives in office in 2010, as you did?
Well, listen, Trevor, I've fought the Conservatives all my life. When I won my seat in Kingston as Surbiton, it was against the Conservatives, and I'm always fighting them in my seat.
Yeah, you didn't fight them for the 5 years that you were minister in their government.
No, but that's my point. I did. I fought them every single day in order to win Liberal Democrat priorities. And we did win. I mean, particularly in my area, we focused on renewables and offshore wind. And we made Britain the world leader in offshore wind. Okay. And that was in the face of Tory opposition. If you remember, take yourself back to those days, George Osborne and people like him were trying to stop me as a Liberal Democrat minister taking forward that agenda, and we won. I fought them and we won. And, that's what we're doing. We're doing, in whatever situation, we will strive to stop them doing what they want to do and make sure the Liberal Democrat agenda, whether it's on fairness, whether it's on the attacking climate change, those sorts of policies come through.
I get the point then. There's no objection in your part, in principle, to being part of some kind of coalition because you can fight from the inside. Let's go back to talk about what you want, which is in your, as you called it, the pre-manifesto document. I looked through the 50 pages of policy, and you said it's a blueprint. You've talked about the NHS already this morning. One of the things that you do highlight in the document is the triple lock on pensions. Yeah. And I just want to be clear, because you'd be the only party to be clear about this. Would you want to keep it if you were a Lib Dem government or part of any other kind of government?
Yes.
Under any circumstances, you will keep the triple lock.
Please, can I explain why? Because it's not just some random thing. The Liberal Democrats first came up with the triple lock. It was a guy called Steve Webb, who became Britain's best pension minister, and we introduced it. Tories weren't keen on it, we introduced it, and we think it's been very successful. And let me explain why, the background. Because it's really important. It's a long history. Pensions over a decade.
We don't need to have the whole long history today.
But the Conservatives broke the link between pensions and earnings back in 1980. And for 30 years, British pensioners fell behind the rest of Europe, and we became bottom of the league for the state pension. Countries that are much less wealthy than us were paying their pensions, are paying their pensions homeowners more. So the triple lock from the Liberal Democrats was designed to try to begin to rectify that. We've had 13 years of the triple lock.
I think people do understand why it's there. I just want to be clear that you are going to stick with it.
I hope you can see the passion
the IFS says
behind
it's going to cost 45 billion, and I just want to get clear, you want to stick with it. Let's talk about a second thing that's in your 50-page document. You're promising 150,000 new council or social housing homes each year. Would any of those be built on the Green Belt?
Almost saying not. If you take our experience in my constituency, we're already building new council houses.
You're in Kingston, in southwest London.
And we're building it on brownfield land. And I have to declare an interest. My wife is a councillor in my constituency, and she's leading on housing. And I'm really proud of what she's been doing. She's now got a programme of building new council homes on brownfield sites, which is the largest programme for over 40 years. We're hoping to build 1,000. And, you know, I'm so proud of her and what the Liberal Democrats are doing. We're showing that our policies can be enacted.
So if I live in the Green Belt and there's a Lib Dem government, I can be absolutely certain you're not going to be sticking a housing development next to me. Keir Starmer says that Labour would consider building on the Green Belt, and he says that he's backing the builders, not the blockers. You OK with being a blocker?
I want to be a builder, but in places where people want houses built. The key thing is to make sure we get the right houses, which means that some have got to be more affordable than the ones that the developer-led approach from the Conservatives produced. But we want to make sure that it's sustainable too. And there is, you know London very well, Trevor.
I do.
Across London, there's so many brownfield sites that have not been built on, where it's perfect for building houses.
All right, I'm hastening you along because you've got limited time. I've actually read through your document, and there are a lot of promises like this. In fact, I counted 24 spending promises, which run...
That's quite standard,
each of which are in the hundreds of millions, including 1,000 more doctors, and there's some which are a billion extra pounds for farmers, £10,000 for every adult to spend on education and training during their lifetimes, add up to 10 billion a year, thereabouts. The question that most people will ask, and you're not saying we might, the document says we will, I counted 36 times. Most people are going to ask, how are we going to pay for all of this? And what I think is really interesting is that, uniquely in politics, you tell us, you say that you are going to raise it through taxes. What taxes?
Well, let me take you through the spending program.
No, don't take me through it. Tell me how you're going to pay for it. Which taxes are going to pay for these tens of billions of promises?
I'm very happy to do that, but it's not all being paid through taxes. That's going to be my point. First of all, a lot of our spending actually saves money. Take our proposal for free personal care. It's got a price tag of 5 billion. You probably read that in that document. But it also saves a huge amount of money on the NHS because people can leave hospital more quickly, so they're not taking up expensive bed space.
You hope you'll save that amount of money. You don't know that, do you?
Well, a lot of I listen to people who've studied this in great detail, and I take what they say very seriously, and that they believe that we can save up to £3 billion from the NHS and the budget on care homes. So I think that's very sensible. You can get better services, you can help the NHS, and you can save money. That makes sense, surely. And, you know, I'm really pleased you've read our document, because when we publish the manifesto, there'll be a fully costed manifesto.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It'll all be full. Actually, the reason this is important, let me remind you of what you say. We will make sure that day-to-day spending does not exceed the amount of money raised in taxes over the medium term, with additional flexibility during periods of economic crisis. I read that as saying that you're going to pay for it through taxes. So let me come back to you. Will you be raising taxes, particularly income tax, to pay for all of that? Your predecessors, Paddy Ashdown said a penny on the pound for education. Nick Clegg wanted a mansion tax. They were very honest. They said, we're going to have to pay for these things. Are you going to want new taxes to pay for all of the things that you've just talked about?
Well, I'm very happy to come to taxes. not least because I've been talking about that during the Parliament. I think at the moment, in a cost of living crisis, it would be wrong to ask families for more tax. But what you can do, and I've been saying this for a few years now, is there are businesses out there who are making a huge amount of money and who could pay. And let me give you some real concrete examples. So I was the first, and Liberal Democrats were the first party to call for a windfall tax on the huge profits of the oil and gas companies in order to pay for some of our help for people struggling with their bills.
The problem is there, Davey, windfall tax happens once. I mean, nobody is going to argue that the promises you make are nice things. The question that they want answered is that if you are serious about being in government, you have to say something about how you want to pay for it. Your predecessors did, and thus far this morning, what you're telling me is that it's all going to pay for itself magically.
No, because I was going to come to something else, but you interrupted me, but that's fine. That's fine, Trevor. Another tax, which isn't a windfall tax, although a windfall tax could raise a huge amount of money, is our proposal to reverse the tax cuts that the Conservatives have given to the banks. That's about £4 billion a year. So that would be a significant change. I think the banks are making lots of profits. I don't see why the Conservatives think they're worth huge tax cuts.
All right. The one thing you haven't said, just very briefly, is that there'll be... you said there's going to be no deals, no pacts. Don't need to go over that. But in truth, the way that you will exercise influence is in some way by supporting potentially a Labour government. Not going to talk about that at all.
The way we're going to exercise influence is if we get lots of Liberal Democrat MPs elected at the next election.
OK.
And what I'm not going to do is what I could criticise...
Your share of the polls has not risen at all in the last couple of years. You're still around 11, 12%. In reality, you're going to have to share power at some point. Are you ever going to talk about that before the electorate has to make a choice?
Well, you mentioned the last few years. Let me tell you, in the last few years, we have won 4 historic by-election victories. We've made huge gains in councils and councillors across the country. But I'm really proud of what we are doing. That's why we're so confident in Bournemouth. And when I look to the next election, I think we will win lots of Liberal Democrat MPs, defeating huge number of Conservatives across the blue wall that I've talked about a lot, and back in the West Country, where I'm so proud we're now winning in the South.
I know, Lib Dems are back in the West Country. Ed Davey, thank you very much indeed. We'll talk again. That was the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey. We'll get the views of our panel on that a bit later, but coming up after the break. The journalist and author Lionel Shriver tells us why she's leaving Britain behind.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Lionel Shriver is the award-winning author of the best-selling book We Need to Talk About Kevin. But it's her often controversial views on Britain that have found prominence in recent years. She's railed against cancel culture and waded into what are called culture wars topics from trans to race. But now she's leaving the UK, and I wanted to know why. So she joins me now. Good morning, Lionel.
Good morning, Trevor.
Where are you off to and why?
We're moving to a small town just outside of Lisbon in Portugal. And I guess the most positive motivation is that my husband and I have reached an age where we think we have one more adventure left in us. And it seemed more exciting and challenging to go somewhere new than to last out our final years in a place that we've become, if anything, too comfortable in.
Ah, it's because you're too comfortable or because you've become uncomfortable in Britain?
Well, it's a combination. I am distressed with what's happening to Britain, and first off, I should tell you that the idea of leaving here really tears me up. I've been here the vast majority of my adult life. My feelings about the country are strong, though that also means that my criticisms of the country are strong. So, you're right that I've been up to my neck in the culture wars here, but I also get a little sick of it. And I am despairing on Britain's account that the country seems to have adopted the conflicts of another country, mine.
The United States.
Right? So all this, what we call woke, for lack of a better word, I know we're all sick of it, it comes from somewhere else. And I think that's undignified, and honestly.
Okay.
Come up with your own screwed up ideology.
That's quite damning, that somebody who comes from the United States, has lived in other parts of the world, in Africa and so on, and transparently likes this country, loves it, is now saying, can't you even get your own crazy ideology right? Let's come back to that in a moment. I wanted to ask you, because it's a politics show, one of the things that you talk a lot about, or you write a lot about, is the power and reach of the state and government. We're seeing this morning that Mr. Sunak wants to essentially, or it is said, wants to stop people smoking even in the outdoors. And obviously, it's healthy, it stops people smoking in other people's faces. How do you feel about that? Healthy policy or nanny state?
Heavy-handed nanny state. Not a very nice nanny. This comes down to one of my biggest problems with the direction of travel in the UK. And that is, it's become increasingly authoritarian, rather than bringing the people along with and trying to go in a certain direction by persuasion, by leading people, and giving people positive reasons to do things. This has become a very authoritarian regime which tries to manipulate through punishment.
Well, let me push back on that. You and I have discussed this in other contexts, but you say it's an authoritarian state, but you've written a lot about, for example, the cancel culture. And isn't the problem there that maybe some of our institutions, our media, our universities and so on, aren't authoritarian enough that the grown-ups, when confronted with, a demonstration that says this person must not speak here, and you've had this experience yourself, basically cower in the corner or back out of the room, that actually they're not strong enough.
Well, I certainly think there's been a failure on an institutional level to stand up to the ideology that we're talking about that I have been opposing for years. So yes, you're right that there's a kind of capitulation or selling out to a particular element, often out of fear. But on a governmental level, legislation is being designed in a very punitive direction, the way net zero is being pursued. The energy bill that passed without any real deliberation most recently has all kinds of powers in it to basically break into your house with the police and force you to get a smart meter. They connect and with the power to put you in jail for up to a year if you don't comply with the new environmental regulations. And these are just householders. We're not talking about people who run companies or something. This is the way things are done. And
we're a long way from Putin or anything, aren't we?
Of course not. But I would like to see a little more contrast. I mean, the thing that really damaged my emotional relationship to this country was COVID. And it demonstrated, I mean, literally overnight, that this country would capitulate to what became a quasi-totalitarian regime. Again, no persuasion, no, we can all be sensible here, no advice. No, more rules.
That is quite an extreme, even for a brilliant writer, quite an extreme proposition. We are not a totalitarian regime, nowhere like it.
No, but overnight, Britons gave up virtually every civil liberty that they ever imagined was their
for the common good.
Ostensibly, but you could have had the same results without that kind of top-down, police arresting people walking in the forest.
One of the things that you've written about recently, which is about the state's responsibilities and so on, is the issue of what you called heritable guilt, inherited guilt, and the case in point is slavery reparations. And your basic case is, how can you make people who live today responsible for something that happened centuries back? Is it really as simple as that?
Morally, yeah, I think it is. It's in the Bible that the son is not to inherit the guilt of the father. That used to be a fundamental Christian principle, and I think that we've lost it. We now think that we are responsible for everything our ancestors ever did, and between slavery and the Industrial Revolution, with its unintended consequences of CO2. No, we have to draw a line. We didn't make those decisions. It's hard enough to take responsibility for the things you do in the present.
I wish we could talk much more, and I hope, actually, you'll be coming back to us from Portugal from time to time.
Indeed.
And we'll see you on the show again.
I hope so.
Lionel Shriver, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure to talk to you, Trevor.
Now, in just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Well, the key findings were that the actual process of going through the criminal justice system and reporting to the police is really compounding the harm of the original sexual assault that survivors have experienced. I think one of the most disturbing findings is that 42% of the respondents said they didn't feel the police believed them. And that is so fundamental to how people are treated and also to how police officers go about investigating crimes if they don't start from a fundamental position that people are coming forward to tell the truth, that it's very difficult to report sexual assaults, and that actually the majority of people say the reason why they report is because they don't want it to happen to anybody else. It's really frustrating because you should feel that the criminal justice process is there for you when you need it, but we see that the way rape is investigated, very, very often the focus is on the credibility of the person who's reporting. You don't find that in any other kind of crime, where it's the victim who feels that they are the one on trial. And we've seen, as part of Operation Soteria, which is the Home Office-funded research that a project that this research is part of, that police are not actually focusing on investigating the suspects. So much of the focus is on investigating the victims, the survivors, and that is something that is really unique to rape. It doesn't happen in other offences, and you know, there really needs to be a complete shift in mindset around that. The process itself is really important. You know, maybe not every case can go to court, but if people feel they've been treated fairly, treated with respect, treated with some kindness, but also fundamentally believed and the evidence they put forward is followed up, then the process itself won't be as damaging. We know it's tough, but what is disturbing is that such a high proportion have said they didn't feel respected or they didn't feel believed, or that all the evidence wasn't followed up. You know, that the two things are linked. The way you go about the process and the end outcome are linked, but it's so important that people feel that going through the process isn't causing them, you know, yet more trauma.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Back to our panel now. Miranda Green, will Ed Davey actually have any influence over the next government, whatever it is?
That's debatable, but for any voters who would like to deprive the Conservative Party of their governing majority, his party matters a lot. Because what you've got now is something that's a little like what you got in 1997, before that incoming Blair landslide, of a very clear complementary pattern of the seats where the Lib Dems could take MPs out, Tory MPs out, and where Labour can. And it's a really different bits of territory. So he matters a lot.
But the truth is that there's a gap between what he says and what he does, because if we look at the Bedfordshire by-election, where the three parties are sort of on a par, though the Lib Dems are a little bit behind, they're saying they're fighting for every vote, so they may actually let the Tories back in.
That's really interesting. I have looked in some detail at this, and I can reassure people that there are only 2 seats in the whole country, like Mid-Bedfordshire, where it's unclear whether the Labour Party or the Lib Dems are actually the true challenger to the Conservatives.
Okay.
It's a really peculiar example, and it's true, actually. It's quite interesting, the extent to which both Labour and the Lib Dems will not let go and will not let the others have a clear run. So you might get the Tories keeping that seat.
Lionel Barber, are the Lib Dems serious yet?
Not yet. They need to become a national party. They haven't been that for some time. Under Nick Clegg, yes. In the old days, when they had seats in Scotland, you remember, up in Orkneys, Borders, David Steele time, they were a national party. Now they're the party of the South. They had 11 seats, they've had a few with by-elections. The problem is that they're kind of local insurgents.
Oh. Jeff, because we've got you on the show, I can't let you go without dealing with the person who many people think has determined the outcome of many of our previous general elections. Rupert Murdoch stepped down as head of his enterprise. Is that the end of an era? Is that the end of influence of the Sun and all of that?
Well, look, first of all, cards on table. I worked for Rupert Murdoch twice. He always treated me with courtesy and respect, and I have a great deal of regard for him. One can only admire the energy of a 92-year-old who gets engaged for the 6th time, then cancels it after a month so he can run off with Roman Abramovich, his mother-in-law.
Let's leave aside his basic rudeness.
So the point I'm making, there's still plenty of lead in the pencil, it seems. And I find it very hard to believe that he will now drift off into the sunset to prune the roses.
It's been a long time since the Sun determined an election.
I would
they
agree
did
with that.
wonderfully well after 1992 in bigging it up. They don't count.
OK, so...
Agreed.
Rupert Murdoch, goodbye. Go and have a drink. You're not there. All right, that is it for this week, Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Thank you so much for spending so much of your Sunday morning with us. Join us again next Sunday at 8:30. Goodbye.